Hey, I'm Courtney Waterman, your tutor. Lover of anime, manga, and math. And you just tuned into another session of Tutor Me Sempai. Welcome back, everyone. Today we're jumping into a 6th grade topic, solving proportions. Now, if you're new to my channel, I'll be putting time codes in for this video in the description box below. So use that to skip ahead to whatever part of the video you think is most interesting. As always, if you have any question what we see here today, or even your own homework, you can always put in my comment box below, or visit me on my Facebook page at Tutor Me Sempai and tell me about it there. Now, this video should be a rather short one, so leave a like, smash the subscribe button, and let's get started. Now, solving a proportion does not have to be terribly difficult. There's only really 2 things you need to know. The first is how to set it up, and the second would be to remember a certain property that proportions have. Now, if you haven't seen my first video on proportions, I recommend you check it out. I have it right up here. It talks about that property and so much more. It gives you pretty much a clear picture of what a proportion is, and I feel like that should be a good first step before you start jumping into how to solve a proportion. So if you don't know what a proportion is, before you jump into solving it, check that video out first and then come back to this one once you have a better understanding. However, today we're going to do a quick recap of at least the property that you got to remember in order to solve your proportion. So the first thing we're going to have to do is write a proportion. So let's say we have something like this. The first ratio 2 to 3, and we know it equals 4 to 6. So if you checked out my first video, you would know that proportions have 2 parts to them. We have the means and we have the extremes. The means of this proportion are going to be the inside numbers. So I put an M there for the means, and the extremes are going to be the outside numbers. So I put an E for extremes. So now we have a proportion and we broke it into its parts. We can now move on to the property that we're going to have to remember in order to solve our proportions. And that is the product of your extremes has to equal the product of your means. So that means when you multiply your extremes together, so let's say 2 times 6, it has to equal whatever you get when you multiply your means together. So 3 times 4. In order for a proportion to be true, this property has to be true. So in other words, for 2 ratios to be equal, the means and extremes have to be in a relationship such as this. Now we see that this is 12 and that is also 12. So this is indeed a proportion. Now I say that with a half-truth almost, because if you saw my first video, we talked about another constraint beyond just these numbers here that are going to control whether you have a proportion or not, and that's you have to take into account the units. However, to simplify things a little bit for this video, we're going to assume that either everything has the same exact unit or this is just a unitless proportion. So the first step in solving your proportion is remembering this property. The product of your means has to equal the product of your extremes. But if you recall, sometimes you don't have your proportion written out in this fashion. If you don't have it in this fashion, but fraction form, you can use something called cross multiplication, in which I've also talked in my last video, and I've actually made a video on cross multiplication that you can find up here as well. So let's say we have the same exact proportion except in fraction form. So we have 2 over 3 equals 4 over 6. Cross multiplication tells us that this product has to equal this product. So you see 2 times 6 equals 3 times 4. Once again, if this is going to be a proportion, this has to be true. So whether you have it in your colon form or your fraction form, remembering that property is going to be key. The next thing you're going to need in order to solve your proportion is know how to set it up. This is going to be the general look of your proportions when you have to solve for it. Just like any other proportion, you're going to have 2 ratios. Now, I wrote them in fraction form, but you don't have to write them in fraction form. You could do them either way, but I'm going to stick to fraction form because it's just easier for me to kind of manipulate my numbers this way, and it makes a lot more sense, especially if you're used to using cross multiplication. But once again, you can always switch these up. But this is going to be your general look whenever you're solving a proportion. So you have your first ratio and your second ratio, and you notice that your second ratio has some sort of letter in it. Now, this letter can be anywhere. It's 4 different spots. 1, 2, 3, 4 spots it can show up. For this one, it's in our third spot, but it can be anywhere. Just know that when you're solving a proportion, you're going to have one spot that is going to be what we call a variable. Now, what is a variable? If you don't know what a variable is just a placeholder. It's just a random thing that we're throwing in one spot because we don't know what it equals. This letter can be any letter. It can be A, B, C. You can throw some Greek letters if you want. It doesn't matter what this is. It's just a placeholder that tells us we don't know what this value is. It'll be equivalent to just writing a question mark here. We don't know what that is. So don't get worried when you see a variable here. It's just a placeholder for an unknown number that we have to solve for. So X is going to be our variable for this question. And this is how your proportion is going to be set up. You're going to have one ratio that has both of its components, the numerator and the denominator known, and you're going to have another ratio that only one of them is going to be known. Once you set up your proportion this way, you can move on to solving that proportion. So let's figure out how to solve this proportion. We've already set it up, so let's figure out what is our missing number here. Remember, the product of your means has to equal the product of your extremes. However, when it's in this form, all you really need to know is cross multiply. When you cross multiply, you're going to focus on your diagonals like this, and you're going to rewrite this as 9 times 10 equals 6 times that X. I'm going to put in parentheses so we know that that is an unknown number. We don't know what that X is supposed to equal. So we have 9 times 10. Now when you multiply those together, we get 90. And you have 6 times X. So you can say 6X. Now there's a few different ways you can solve this. You can plug in a bunch of different numbers into X to figure out when you multiply by 6, which gives you 90, or you can do it in much simpler fashion. Get X by itself. If you get X by itself, you don't have to worry about what X is. It's going to naturally fall into your lap. If you get it by itself, you're going to have this in terms of X, and you'll see what I mean by that. Well, we have a 6 times X. How do we get X by itself? Well, this is connected through multiplication. So in order to get it by itself, we have to divide both sides by 6. When you do that, the 6 divided by 6 cancels out and you get a 1, right? So that's 1 times X. And we know that whenever you multiply 1 by anything, you're going to get that something back. So we could just say it equals X. 90 divided by 6 gives you what? 15. So instead of plugging a bunch of numbers into X to figure out what product is going to give you 90, you can just get X by itself by dividing both sides by 6. And when you do, you get the answer. X has to be 15. Now, I always recommend checking your work. It doesn't hurt to plug things in to make sure that it really does work. You don't want to mess up your math somewhere, not catch it, and then put your answer down thinking you have it correct and you didn't catch your mistake. So take this X, plug it in, and make sure we get the same thing. So we're going to start with our proportion. We have 9 over 6 equals, what is X? Well, we said it's 15. So 15 over 10. And remember, our cross multiplication tells us we're going to have this and this. 9 times 10 equals 6 times 15. What is this first part here? 9 times 10. Well, we already know that's going to be 90. How about this here? 6 times 15. Well, 6 times 15 is also going to be 90. So we know that 90 equals 90, so we know that this is indeed correct. And that's how you solve a proportion. You start with your proportion, figure out your cross multiplication if you have it in fraction form, and you can isolate X. If you isolate X or whatever your variable is, it's going to mean that whatever your end result is, that's your answer. So I hope you're following today's examples, and I hope you realize that solving a proportion does not have to be too difficult. Remember your two things, how to set it up, and that the product of your means has to equal the product of your extremes, or simply remember your cross multiplication and your diagonals. Remember, if you have any question about what we saw today or even your own homework, you can always put it in the comment box below or visit me on my Facebook page at Tutor Me Sempai and tell me all about it there. If you haven't done so already, remember to leave that like. It really helps the channel by letting YouTube know that you found this video helpful. And if you found it helpful, so can somebody else. So hit that like, smash the subscribe, hit the notification bell, and while you're at it, share this video with a friend. Well, that's all the time I have for today. I'm really hoping this helped with your homework, and I'm looking forward to see you again next week. I'm Courtney, and this is another session of Tutor Me Sempai.